Then. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Sachs at Columbia University, and welcome to Book Club. We're having wonderful, wonderful discussions with world-leading thinkers this year to talk about history, politics, our global challenges. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be in conversation with my colleague, Professor Rashid Khalidi. Welcome, Rashid. So great to be talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
And thanks for your absolutely stupendous book. We're talking about the 100 Years' War on Palestine. I have it here in my Kindle. Please, everybody, get a copy of this, read it. It's an absolutely remarkable book, Rashid. It's both a phenomenal history of the Palestine question, the Palestine-Israel conflict over 100 years, and interwoven in that, of course, is your family's history, because in every way and in every stage of this conflict, and well before 100 years, your family was involved in leadership in Palestinian culture and the arts and politics, and in this conflict itself, as you have been. I should properly introduce you. You're not only my friend and colleague, but the very distinguished Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies in the Department of History at Columbia University. And just as a matter of quick background, Professor Khalidi's PhD, DPhil, is from Oxford after a BA at Yale University, and you've taught in so many distinguished settings: American University of Beirut, University of Chicago, and now, thank goodness for me and for all of us at Columbia University. And you hold the chair, the Edward Said Chair, and of course, Professor Edward Said was a great scholar and great public intellectual. And you quote him in a very pertinent quote that I think may be epigrammatic of your book. You talk about his quotation of the permission to narrate. Right. And I wonder if you could just explain what he meant by that and why you see that as relevant.
Well, it is epigrammatic, as you say. One of the saddest things about what has been happening in Palestine is that for a very large part of that time, the Palestinians have been voiceless. They haven't been allowed, or they haven't been able, or they haven't been able to strongly make their voice heard. And quite frequently, this is a matter of getting permission. It's very, very hard to break through the static, to break through the censorship, to break through the hostility, and put a Palestinian narrative out there. It's much easier perhaps today than it has been in the past, but this has always been a problem. I just read about a university the other day where a speaker, they were bringing a speaker, and they said, no, you cannot have a Palestinian speaker without an Israeli. Well, the idea that you would have somebody speak about slavery and have a slaveholder, or that you'd have somebody speak about gun violence and have a guy from the National Rifle Association is outrageous in an academic context. But in our context, it is standard if a voice is allowed to be heard in the first place. So I think it sums up a big part of the problem.
Rashid, during this year, during the COVID year, we've all had more time in isolation, and a lot of us, I know, have been using it to read. I've been reading a lot of history, and what struck me about the great histories that I've been reading, including your book, is how, at least at this stage of my life, it's mostly about unlearning what I thought I knew rather than learning, because we carry around narratives and ideas, and those narratives in general are the narratives of the powerful. Just as you said, and history is written by the victors. And the Palestinian side is not known. And this is one of the reasons why your book is so absolutely powerful and so important for people to read. But I wanted to read one more of these epigrammatic statements because it's exactly also in the same philosophy. Then we'll turn to your narrative. You quote the French historian Georges Duby, who says, "I was trying to see how an event is made and unmade, as ultimately it only exists via what one says about it, since it is properly speaking fabricated by those who spread its renown." What a great quotation. But the idea is that history is so much what we're told, not what was or what should be understood. And so I want to turn in our unfortunately short 1 hour together to 100 years, which you call 100 Years War on Palestine. And the book is divided into 6 declarations of war,
right,
by imperial powers and by the Zionist movement on the Palestinian Arab people. And you start with this phenomenal interchange of your great uncle, Yusuf Dia al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi, who
right.
corresponds with Herzl. Could you describe that? It's amazing, absolutely amazing.
Well, let me give a little background. Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi was someone who had served multiple times as mayor of Jerusalem. He'd served as deputy for Jerusalem in the first elected Ottoman parliament in the 1870s. He was a scholar. He taught and studied in Vienna at the Imperial Royal University. And he knew of Herzl. And he knew a lot about Zionism because, I mean, he had been mayor of Jerusalem and the Zionist movement was growing. And he read the Austrian press. I know this because I found the newspapers in the family library that he subscribed to. So he was fully aware.
And then, by the way, just to mention, the family library is an institution in Jerusalem
yes.
that reflects the collected works of your great relatives.
It was founded by my grandfather to put together all the manuscripts in the family. So it has manuscripts that go back 1,000 years. It has also materials from the family. So he knew of Herzl. He understood what the Zionist movement was doing, and he wrote Herzl a letter via the intermediary of the Grand Rabbi of France and said to him, you know, I sympathize with Zionism in certain respects. I understand what's going on with Jews in Europe. And he concluded by saying, however, Palestine already has a population that won't agree to be superseded. And for God's sakes, leave Palestine alone. So I cite that letter, and then I cite Herzl's response, which is a masterpiece of evasion. I won't go into what Herzl said, but I say—
well, tell us a little bit about what Herzl said.
One thing he says is, this is going to be good for you. A project which Yusuf Dia knew was designed to create a Jewish state in Palestine. That was the title of Herzl's book, which had been published by this time, was going to be good for the indigenous population. He also said, we wouldn't dream of forcing you out. And Yusuf Dia nowhere in his letter mentioned expulsion or removal of the population. So either Herzl had a guilty conscience, or, which in fact from his diaries we knew.
But you mentioned in his diary that there was already discussion about how the poor Palestinians will be moved out.
Spirited across the frontiers is how it's put in the diaries. So I think that this exchange is paradigmatic. You essentially have propaganda coming back from Herzl and a refusal to engage with anything that his Palestinian interlocutor is actually saying.
One thing, Rashid, I discovered during this year of relearning history is I also went back to read John Locke's second treatise on government again for the first time in 50 years, I think. And Locke was also a part of the settler movements, settler colonialism. But in Locke's case in 1690, the English settler colonialism in the Americas. And Locke, for his benefactor, wrote part of the settler constitutions for the Carolinas. And what's fascinating about Locke, which is similar to what you say about Herzl, is the argument, this is good for you, that we come in and take your land. And one of the things that Locke said is that the Indians, the Native Americans, don't use the land properly. They
Right.
only get 1/10 of the productivity of the land. So if we come in and take the land, we're giving back something to humanity after all, because we're increasing
Right.
the productivity of the land. And that's a gift for humanity, without any awareness that it's a loss for the person or the groups that it's being taken away from. So I think it is interesting that this view of settler colonialism goes far back in self-justification, in easy, complacent justification. It will be good for you,
Exactly.
not to worry.
Exactly.
Even the great philosophers, at least I thought great until rereading some of it, have propounded that idea, not to worry. Well, you talk about 6 wars on the Palestinians, and the first, which dates the 100 years bracketing of the book, is the Balfour Declaration and the beginning of the formal colonial settlement under British auspices. Could you describe that? Because I'm sure that many people listening in know something about it, but they don't really know enough about it.
Right. The Balfour Declaration was a statement by the British government in the name of the cabinet, saying that His Majesty's government looked with favor on the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was one sentence. There were 2 other clauses, one of which said that the existing non-Jewish population would have civil and religious rights, and that the status of Jews in other countries would not be affected. So what was basically being said here was that there's one people in Palestine with national and political rights, and there's not another people in Palestine. This is why I describe it as a declaration of war. 94, 95, 93% of the population of Palestine, the Arab, Muslim, and Christian population of Palestine, was essentially ignored in the Balfour Declaration. In fact, they were told, first of all, they were never named, and they were told, you're not a nation, you don't have national rights, and you will not have political rights. You will only have civil, i.e. you can sue in court for protect your property, and religious rights. And this was then incorporated.
But they were only 94% of the population.
But I mean, that is a European settler colonial mentality. It was shared by the Zionist movement. That we know now about the negotiations over this. And Chaim Weizmann, who at that stage had become the head of the Zionist movement, was deeply involved, as were President Wilson, Louis Brandeis, many other people involved with the Zionist movement in persuading the British to accept this. Of course, the British had their own reasons for doing this, which were essentially strategic and had nothing to do with Zionism or Jews or anything else. Britain wanted to control Palestine since before World War I. I describe it as a declaration of war because what it meant was, first of all, that the Palestinians don't exist. And if you look at the Mandate for Palestine, which is thereafter established by the League of Nations, it not only incorporates the Balfour Declaration, it expands on it in every respect. The Palestinians are never mentioned as the primary national community in their own country, anywhere in either document, the Mandate for Palestine or the Balfour Declaration. And ultimately, such a setup can only be imposed by force. And the British then ultimately did have to use force. It took a while, but eventually they had to bring in 100,000 troops and launch a campaign that lasted over 3.5 years in the late 1930s to crush Palestinian resistance to essentially their dispossession.
Describe how this fits into the broader picture of British-French imperialism after World War I, and also a little bit about the multiple promises that were given
Right.
all over the place to what would become Palestine.
Right. Well, a wit, I forget who it was, described Palestine as the thrice promised land, because the British had made commitments to the Arabs in 1915 and 1916. They had made commitments.
That's what we know from Lawrence of Arabia, for those who have seen the movie.
Yeah.
Or studied that.
Another reason people think they know things that they actually know nothing about. They've been totally misinformed by Lawrence's own largely fictional account on which the largely fictional movie is based. In any case, so the correspondence with the leaders of the Arab nationalist movement in 1915, 1916 made a bunch of promises the negotiations with the French, the so-called Sykes-Picot Accords of 1915, 1916, involved another set of commitments. And finally, there was the Balfour Declaration in 1917. In each of these, the British essentially made contradictory promises. And I quote Balfour, a confidential memo by Balfour, in which he essentially says, this is privately directed to his colleagues in the cabinet, we've made no statement on Palestine, which we haven't ultimately intended to, which we've intended, in fact, not to keep. It's a remarkable statement.
Yeah, the statement is nothing we've said is true.
Exactly, and we never meant anything we said.
What was the word homeland supposed to mean? What did people interpret that as? What did the Zionists think it was? What did the British think it was? Why was that term chosen?
Well, the Zionists meant it to stand in for what they wanted, which was a Jewish state in Palestine. And if you go back and you read what Herzl said, and you read what was going on at the Zionist congresses that started in Basel in 1897, it's perfectly clear that what they wanted, and Herzl makes this absolutely crystal clear. We must have sovereignty and control over immigration so that we can essentially replace the existing population by bringing in so many people. So as far as the Zionists are concerned, that's what they meant. The British government watered it down for a variety of reasons. But what Balfour, David Lloyd George, the prime minister, and Winston Churchill, who was an ardent Zionist, meant, they said to Weizmann, and it's recorded in Weizmann's diaries, we always meant this to be ultimately a state. Once you bring in enough people, then you will have your state. In other words, by keeping the doors of immigration open, by the arrival of Jews from abroad, you will ultimately have a majority, and then you will have a state. What the Arabs understood it to mean was something completely different. They assumed that what the Zionists wanted was what the British were trying to achieve, but that the British weren't honest enough to say outright, we are going to impose a Jewish state on you, even though you're the the Arabs, are a majority.
I think it's fascinating to just understand a bit more about the mindset and maybe to discuss it. Obviously, it touches on some of the most sensitive and conflictive issues imaginable, but here was a place where, as you say, 94% of the population are Palestinian Arabs settled for.
Obviously, that proportion goes down as immigration.
Of course, but at the start of this idea, this is a Palestinian Arab country and or land, part of the Ottoman Empire until that moment. And here's the idea that there's going to be created a Jewish state, in essence, as you say. And the roots of that are varied. Herzl himself was not an ardently religious figure. He was a secular figure trying to find a practical solution to European anti-Semitism. It strikes me that the British...
and he was also a nationalist. I mean, it was not just resolution of the Jewish problem, which is the problem of Christian anti-Semitism, historic problem of Christian. It was also that he believed that the Jews were a people and should be a modern nation, not just a people in some amorphous sense.
Right, so and of course,
Zionists were nationalists as well as...
moment of history, national determination was seen as the essence of every kind of people's rights and survival.
Exactly.
The British, of course, were the dominant imperial power. So the idea of British settlement wasn't exactly new. There were British settlements and conquests all over the world. So there wasn't very much compunction about that. It does strike me that probably the idols of the Crusades 1,000 years before must have played some role, that this is, you know, we have a claim to the Middle East period, and it goes back in a great tradition.
In fact, the British and the French papers were full of that stuff. When the French conquered Damascus in 1920, when the British conquer Jerusalem in 1917, there's all kinds of Crusader imagery in the papers in France and in Britain.
And then there is the Jewish religious idea that this is a land given by God to the Jewish people. What strikes me as interesting about that also, by the way, aside from claiming land 2,000 years afterwards, where someone else lives, is that the Jewish religious claim itself was itself a settler claim, because the Jews are told, we will allow you to conquer someone else's land. So it's directly in the Bible that this is not our ancient homeland, this is our land to conquer. So the book of Joshua is a book of genocides, actually, where the Jewish people conquer a land given by God against the native inhabitants. So it seems to me the deck is kind of stacked against the Palestinians, because the notion for us, looking back, that this kind of imperial, hypocritical insertion of a population is illegitimate, probably didn't feel very illegitimate to those protagonists at the time, in the sense that imperial power, a religious tradition of conquest, after all, not just a religious tradition of a homeland, but a religious tradition of conquest of that homeland, and a crusader mentality, probably all played somehow into the mentality of the normalcy of what strikes one, in my view, as utterly abnormal and deeply, deeply unjust in many ways.
By 21st century standards.
Yes.
I mean, but you're right, in terms of early 20th century standards. First of all, colonialism was a good thing, and settler colonialism was a very good thing, because as you said, it did good things for the indigenous population. We are here to benefit you. And of course, we're going to benefit ourselves as well. The other thing is the irony, one of the ironies of Zionism, is that the religious connection and the sense that the land of Israel had been given to the Jewish people by, as it were, God's land deed, was something that religious Jews understood as something that would only be actuated at the end of days. The secular attempts to change the situation were impious and heretical and absolutely unacceptable. Whence the extremely strong religious hostility to Zionism in this era, that is to say at the turn of the 20th century, and in fact right up until the 21st century. For many, many, many pious religious Jews, this is not something that's supposed to be done with guns or via conquest, a la Joshua, but is rather something that, God is going to restore the Jewish people to the land of Israel in his good time.
By the way, one of the most ironic and bizarre moments I can recall is the day that Ahmadinejad came to the Columbia campus, and there were big protests. And I was fortunately off campus because I had an event at the UN. It was at the UN General Assembly. So I was walking to the UN, and when I got to 47th Street, there was a big demonstration, anti-Zionist demonstration. Who was it? It was hundreds of rabbis holding signs that Zionism is against the Jewish religion. So it's so bizarre, the different perspectives on this. But as you say, one of the deeply pious views was, while God had promised the land, he didn't promise it unconditionally. It would come when justice prevailed in the world.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
There are many twists and turns on this. But let me bring us through a lot of history that I urge people read the book so that you can get the detailed facts. But this first beginning of the settler Zionism comes to what you call the Second Declaration of War, which is really pivotal. After World War II, 1947, 1948, and the partition under the UN General Assembly, and then the Declaration of Israel, and then the war and the Nakba, the disaster of Palestinian expulsion. Could you talk about that period?
Sure. I talk about this as a declaration of war. I mean, again, it's a matter of an established narrative, which is obviously partly true, but largely false. The established narrative is that the miraculous resurrection of the Jewish people in their homeland after the Holocaust was an entirely good thing. And given what had happened in Nazi Germany before and during World War II, culminating in the Holocaust, this was understandable and necessary and right. The problem with that narrative is that it ignores the fact that the Palestinians were still a majority of this country. And when the UN General Assembly in November 1947 partitioned the country, it gave 57% of the country to a minority and gave the rest to the majority of the people. The other aspect of this is that both the Charter of the United Nations and the Covenant of the League of Nations had talked about self-determination. The Palestinians had been prevented by the British from achieving self-determination in the entirety of their own country because of this international commitment to Zionism. And so, in effect, what the UN General Assembly was doing, at the impulsion mainly of the United States and the Soviet Union, who bulldozed this resolution through the General Assembly in 1947, was to give the bulk of the country to a minority, which was perfectly prepared to take over as much of it as they could. And they proceeded to do that. You mentioned the war. The war actually started before the establishment of the state.
And I think this is actually a very important point that
Right.
I didn't know also. It's one
Right.
of the many things I had to unlearn and learn.
Right.
But can you describe, after the partition, then the violence actually starts?
Exactly.
Even
exactly.
before the declaration of Israel's independence and any formal war, the war starts from
very soon after partition is announced. So the chronology is important. November 29th, 1947, General Assembly votes for partition. Within weeks, there's fighting in different parts of Palestine. By the early spring, the well-organized, well-armed militias of the Zionist movement are overrunning Arab villages. And by April, they're overrunning Arab cities. Before the state of Israel is established in the middle of May, when the British leave, of 1948, almost the entire Arab population of Jaffa, the entire Arab population of Haifa, 60,000 people in each case, and about 30,000 people living in the Arab neighborhoods of West Jerusalem are driven from their homes. So about 150,000 people in the cities and another 150,000 people in villages are driven from their homes as these areas are conquered. The United Nations does nothing to stop this. An Arab state was supposed to be established. Many of these areas that are overrun, like Jaffa, were to have been part of the Arab state. And this is part of why I call this a declaration of war.
Yeah. To understand this, the usual narrative is there's a partition, the Arabs reject it, the Palestinians reject it, Israel declares independence, and then there's a war. But the chronology is quite different.
Right.
The chronology is that there is a partition, and before anything happens politically, the war starts from the Zionist side.
Well, from both sides. From both
sides. But the expulsions of the Zionists, the expulsions of the Palestinians, takes place in large numbers before May 1948.
About 40% of the Palestinians who are expelled or flee their homes do so before May 15th, 1948. Something like 300,000 of the 750,000, maybe 350,000 of the 750,000 who are driven ultimately from their homes by 1949 leave before the state of Israel is established, before the Arab armies enter. In fact, this is one of the main reasons the Arab armies enter. They were very reluctant to do so. They knew that the Zionist movement was stronger than them. They had, the Arab chiefs of staff had said, these people are well-armed, well-organized, well-trained, they're going to win. And we have to come across miles of desert. We're not very well equipped. Don't do it. And the political leaders are driven to do it. The other important...
To what extent were these expulsions more or less planned and ready? These were operations designed to do this removal of populations, do you think?
One of the very contentious points about what happens in 1948 is to what extent were these expulsions planned? The conquests were planned. we have the various plans of the general staff of the Haganah, Aleph, Gimel, Dalet, and so on and so forth. The most important of which was the Plan Dalet, which led to many of the conquests that I'm talking about. And each of these was accompanied by attacks on civilians or psychological warfare to drive them out. So it was intended. To what extent was it planned? Well, we don't actually have. The historians who have done work on this have actually not found the document that says you will drive every single person out of their homes. And in fact, not every single person was driven out. Most people were. A few stayed. And in other areas later on, many more people stayed. So you end up having 150,000 Arabs who become citizens of the state of Israel later on. But the overwhelming majority, 750,000, are driven out. This was intentional. This was clearly part of the objective. You could not have created a Jewish state in a majority Arab country without this demographic transformation. And this is something that had been welcomed by the Zionist movement since the British first mooted what they called population transfer in 1937. Ben-Gurion was ecstatic. He says, this gives us the opportunity to move these people. Exactly as Herzl had said in his diaries, we have to move these people across the frontiers. You can't have a Jewish state in a majority Arab country otherwise. It's an absolute necessity. So it was intentional. Is there a specific plan? No historian seems to have been able to find a specific plan which says, yes, we will expel everybody on these dates. No, that did not exist.
What was happening to your family at this point? And your father was at this point already working with the UN, or
yes.
Do I have the dates wrong?
No, he was already working with the UN as a broadcaster initially, and later on in human rights. He had various jobs at the UN. My father was in Palestine in 1947, and actually was in Amman meeting with Emir Abdullah, later King Abdullah, the first of Jordan, the day that partition was announced. And I describe in my book what my father told me about that meeting just before he died, just before my father died. And I should probably say, as much as I can in this book, I try and illustrate these dry historical facts with accounts from people who were involved. And as we get closer to the present, from things that I myself saw.
Yeah, well, it's incredible how your family was intertwined in every one of these events so directly.
I could have done this using another family's archive, but I happen to have my own family's archive. I could have used other people's memoirs. In fact, in some places I do. I use a few memoirs, several memoirs by people I knew who were themselves involved or witnessed the events.
But Abdullah was not very concerned about the Palestinian plight.
Quite the contrary. My father was sent by his older brother, who was one of the members of the Arab Higher Committee in Jerusalem in 1947, to tell Abdullah that the Palestinians did not want his protectorship, his guardianship. He was very angry. And when at that moment, somebody came in and announced that the BBC had just broadcast that partition had been passed by the General Assembly, he gets up, and at that point, the audience ends. When the Emir gets up, everybody gets up. And he turns to my father and he says, you Palestinians have refused my offer. You deserve what's going to happen to you. So my father told me this story, and I realized it's important, and I remembered it, and I wrote it down. And later on, I was talking to an Israeli historian friend of mine, and he said, oh, that explains why suddenly the tone of Golda Meir and Moshe Sharett later, who had been meeting with Abdullah, changes at this point, because Abdullah had thought he had the Palestinians in his pocket, and it's after your father's message that he realized he didn't.
Mm-hmm. The third conflict is the Six-Day War.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, I talk about the war, which is, again, one of the things that is misremembered and misunderstood by the grand American public and by many people the world over, because there is an assumption that the Arab countries were on the verge of overrunning Israel, and that another Holocaust was possible. One of the things I show from American documents and also some Israeli documents is that everybody who knew anything about the military situation knew that Israel would crush the Arab armies even if they attacked first. And that Israel was planning a preemptive strike and was going to crush them even more decisively.
And fascinatingly came and asked for permission to do that.
Well, that's the key thing. This was not an Israeli war. This was an Israeli war with American permission. Secretary McNamara, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, President Johnson both meet with the Israeli envoy, who is the head of the Mossad, Meir Amit, and they basically tell him, "Yes, go ahead and do it. You're gonna win anyway, but yes, whatever, fine." So I argue this is in a sense a joint war, and the declaration of war is not just the war itself, but more importantly, the UN Security Council resolution, which is adopted in November of 1967, and which basically buries the Palestine question, all the issues opened by the 1948 war.
Not for the first time.
Not for the first time. The issue of refugees, the return of refugees, which the United Nations had mandated in a resolution in December 1948. It said refugees have the right to return and compensation, buried in 242. All 242 says is a just solution of the refugee problem. They don't even deign to mention the Palestinian refugee problem or how it is to be solved by return and compensation, which up till that point had been the UN and the American position on refugees.
Oh, moreover, I missed that point. So this was actually a retrogression even from the 1948 period.
Precisely. It's essentially drafted by the Americans and the Israelis and the British. Lord Carradine, the British permanent representative, is the one whose name was on the resolution. But essentially, it was Dean Rusk, Ambassador Goldberg, and a bunch of other people, together with Abba Eban, the Israeli foreign minister, who laid down the essential lines of 242. So I talk about it as a declaration of war on the Palestinians because they're not even mentioned in the resolution. The word Palestine doesn't exist in 242. Palestinians. It's sort of like the Balfour Declaration, sort of like the mandate. Exactly.
It's repeatedly the same point that there is only one political nation and everyone else happens to be there.
We still have those two scales. Israel's security in American political parlance is on a level, close to God. Whereas the security of the Palestinians, yes, of course they should have, but it's not. It hasn't got the same sacrosanct quality. Israeli rights, the existence of Israel, these are sacrosanct in American political discourse. What about the Palestinians' right to exist? Palestine's right to exist. Why is this one pounded home by every politician on every stump and by every American diplomat, and the other one is barely mentioned, or if it's mentioned, it's in a subordinate position. So this has been a constant issue.
You enter the story now as a scholar and increasingly a diplomat yourself, starting in 1982 onward. So you call 1982 the fourth declaration of war.
Right.
You're in Beirut at that point, I think.
Right.
And Mona, your wife, our dear friend, is pregnant at the time and working in the Palestinian news agency. Correct. And suddenly the bombings start. It's an incredibly harrowing account. Can you describe that for people? It was just shocking.
Right. Well, I describe it as the fourth declaration of war because just as in 67, Israel sends an envoy to Washington who gets approval from Washington for what it's about to do. So Ariel Sharon comes to Washington, meets with Secretary of State Haig, who gives him a green light. That then started on I believe it was the 4th of June or the 6th of June, with an aerial bombardment that targeted the area where the PLO offices were, including the office where my wife was working. And I was at the American University of Beirut at the time, and our two daughters, my wife was pregnant with our third child, and our two daughters were in two separate schools. So I was worried about my wife, who I knew was under bombardment that afternoon. I was worried about my two kids who were in two separate places. You have to have lived under aerial bombardment to know how terrifying it is to hear the sound, not just of the bombs, but of the planes, the fighter bombers, making their passes, screeching. And we were all hearing this all over Beirut, even though where I was at the AUB wasn't actually being targeted at the time. And of course, the kids were undoubtedly terrified in their schools. So I describe, what happened that afternoon, which anybody who's been in a war zone has been through again and again and again and again.
But Rashid, isn't it right to think of this as one grad lie leading to the next, in the sense that if you start with the premise, we're going to have a new state or a new homeland, and ignore the people that are there, then those peoples are expelled in significant numbers.
Well, first they resist. And then that resistance is then described as banditism or terrorism or whatever. I mean, the British arrive in Ireland and the Irish resist. And of course, the Irish are slandered by the British for resisting British settler colonialism. And that's what happens in Palestine. The first thing is they resist, and then that is an excuse for their expulsion.
By the way, on a completely different subject, I'm very worried and upset about the current American attempt to create a Cold War with China. And just as an aside, as part of this, the US and Europe have put sanctions on China. And when China retaliated with its own corresponding sanctions, the European Union announced today, well, how dare they put sanctions on? This calls into question our whole relationship. So it is a little bit unbelievable. But
what's sauce for the goose is not sauce for the gander. We can do it, but you can't.
So in this case, there's resistance, expulsion, formation of a political consciousness and movement outside of Israel in Beirut, but that almost inevitably in the minds of this project leads to this war, because you have to go after the resistance wherever it is.
Exactly.
Is that fair to say?
Exactly. I mean, and this is par for the course for other wars waged by colonial powers against their opponents. The French are attacking Morocco and Tunisia when the FLN sets up bases there as part of the Algerian War of National Independence. South Africans are attacking Mozambique and attacking other neighboring countries in order to root out the ANC. And so Israel comes into Lebanon as part of exactly the process that you're talking about in 1982, and occupies much of the country. And so that's what I describe in that chapter.
Yeah, and
as well at the end as the Sabra and Shatila massacres, for which I use as a source the previously unpublished confidential annexes to the Israeli report on these massacres, which show the extent of collaboration, not just between Israel and the right-wing Lebanese militias that actually carry out the massacres, but also the degree of responsibility of the United States for what happens after the PLO forces are obliged to leave in August and early September of 1982.
And of course,
leave Beirut.
What is so depressing in history is that the authors of the massacre, the main author, goes on to become prime minister. You know, in other words, the accountability is not only zero, it's contrary.
Right.
So repeated. Well, the next phase of this is what many of us thought was the breakthrough, and you were part of that. You saw it close up, and you expressed a great unhappiness about the whole process. And I'm referring, of course, to the Oslo Accord and the peace negotiations, which in the 1990s seemed like it was going to lead finally to some kind of settlement. And right. I wonder, since you were one of the advisors to the Palestinian side at that point, you watched the diplomacy, you participated in close up. What did you see? And right. Why was it ever hopeful, and why did it end up collapsing?
Right. I was involved as an advisor to the Palestinian side in the negotiations that started at Madrid in October of 1991, and I continued to do that until the summer of '93. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the PLO in Israel had opened up a direct channel, which ultimately led to the Oslo Accords, about which we didn't know until September when they were revealed, and the accords were signed on the White House lawn. In the almost 2 years, year and a half, almost 2 years that I was involved as an advisor, one of the things I realized I had not when I first started this was that there was a ceiling to the negotiations imposed by the Israelis and the Americans, which ultimately prevented any possibility of statehood, self-determination, sovereignty for the Palestinians. A
a pre-cooked ceiling, basically.
Exactly. And it went right back to the 1978 Camp David Accords that Begin, Sadat, and President Carter signed for Palestinian autonomy. There was also a peace treaty with Egypt that came out of that, but the Palestinian autonomy part of that was essentially the ceiling. Begin wanted to settle the entirety of the land of Israel. As far as Begin was concerned, all of it belonged to Israel. And as far as Begin was concerned, nothing would be accepted that in any way limited the colonization and the settlement and the absorption of the entirety of Palestine.
Of what
and that's why the autonomy,
West Bank, for example, now
the West Bank in particular, and East Jerusalem in particular, were his focus. I mean, at that stage, they hoped to keep Gaza. Ultimately, they decided they couldn't. But the West Bank in particular, and Jerusalem, most importantly, as far as Begin were concerned, were vitally important. And that ceiling was retained even by Prime Minister Rabin when he came in 1992. Unfortunately, people have said, well, he agreed to accept that the Palestinians are a people. Correct. He agreed to negotiate directly with the PLO. Correct. He made major changes. Israel had never accepted that the Palestinians had any legitimacy as a group. So Rabin accepted that, and he accepted that the PLO was a legitimate interlocutor, and he negotiated with them. But he never went farther than that, to say the Palestinians have a national right in this country, that they have a right to self-determination, they have a right to statehood, they have a right to sovereignty. He never fully accepted that. His last speech, which I quote in the book, said they'll have something much less than that, before he was assassinated by somebody who thought he'd already gone too far, a right-winger who thought he'd right. So what we realized in the course of the negotiations was that the Americans and the Israelis had a preset ceiling, which they imposed on us, and which ultimately, through the Oslo Accords, was intended essentially to perpetuate the status quo of Israeli control.
What happened at the end with Clinton? What was there anything there, an opportunity with the Clinton at the last stage?
People talk about the 2000 Camp David summit, which Clinton convened with Prime Minister then Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat, and say, this was an opportunity. In fact, Clinton had frittered away years and years from the time he came into office in January 1993 until he was a dead duck. He wasn't a lame duck. He was in the last couple of months of his presidency. He had absolutely no clout by that stage. Why this had not happened in 98, 97, 96, 95, 94, 93 is inconceivable to me, except that, he got distracted by other things, and he obviously didn't think it was that important. Whatever the reason, Clinton was in a terrible position to negotiate a settlement. Moreover, Arafat had lost support because people had seen over 7 years how bad the Oslo Accords were. And Barak was already losing his legitimacy in Israel. He had lost a no confidence vote in the Knesset. He was also a lame duck. So bringing these three together in the fall of 2000, just before the American elections, in which Al Gore lost, was a sort of last ditch effort, and it had no hope of achieving a transformation of the situation.
The last war is part of an American crusade in the Middle East. 9/11 comes, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and later the wars in Syria and Libya, in which the U.S. is deeply involved as protagonist. It's the rise of the religious right at the core of American politics, which surely plays a role in this also, because probably even stronger than Jewish support for Israel is the evangelical Christian right support for Israel. As
nowadays, that's true. Nowadays, that's true.
For Armageddon. Very weird period. But could you briefly describe that? Bring us up to where we are right now.
Yeah, I focus on a couple things in the last part of the book. I focus on the wars on Gaza, which are not even-handed conflicts. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to shatter in this book overall is this idea that there are two more or less equal protagonists. There are not. There is a dominant protagonist, massively supported by external powers.
By the two
Zionist
leading
movement,
empires of the last 2 centuries, Britain and
Zionist
the
movement
US.
in Israel. And there is a people that is trying to, resist this settler colonial takeover of their country. And the last episode of this in terms of a war is the wars on Gaza of 2008, 9, 2012, and most brutally 2014. And I go in great detail through what actually happened in these wars and the degree of American support for this and the degree to which this is a violation of American law in terms of arms sales. I mean, American arms are only supposed to be sold under the Defense Procurement Act for defensive purposes. And the killing of 15 or 1,600 Palestinian civilians in Gaza in 2014, including 500 children, it cannot possibly be described as defensive purposes. You look at the casualty tolls. Most of the Israeli casualties are Israeli soldiers who are who are attacking Gaza, who are inside Gaza, fighting in Gaza, and a few civilians. And you have 1,500 Palestinian civilians, and yet the way the war is told in the American media and by American politicians is the Palestinians are attacking Israel with rockets. Now they were firing rockets, there's no question. But what we're seeing here is the last episode of a war which is intended to crush the Palestinians and ultimately establish this state in the entirety of Palestine. And the United States is party to this. I described the last several wars from '67 onward as joint operations between Israel and the United States. And the culminating element of this is the Trump plan, now perhaps superseded, in which the U.S. government under Trump essentially gives Israel, the Netanyahu government, everything it wants. You want Jerusalem, you got it. You want the Golan Heights, you got it. You want settlements to be described as legal, you want it, got it. You want annexation, you got it. Whether that will continue to be American policy is another issue.
So, Rashid, in our remaining 2 minutes, I'm sorry to say, can there be justice in this world? Can there be a compromise still? Can there be a one-state solution, a two-state solution, any solution? The Palestinian people are still there in the millions. The millions of refugees are still there. People are not going away. I'm sorry to ask it in such an absurd way with our clock ticking down, but what do you look forward to in how to move this forward? Your narrative, I believe, is extremely important because it helps to set the foundations of truth. And I think the main point I would emphasize is until we understand the truth, we will not get a solution.
I agree. And I think that's the key thing. If you start off from a false starting point, you're going to end up with a result that's not going to work. If you don't recognize some of these things that I'm arguing here in this book, you won't get a just outcome. And if the outcome isn't just and isn't based on equality, it's not going to be sustainable. It won't work in the long term. You can impose certain things, but unless and until the Palestinians are completely extirpated, eliminated, which has not happened, that simply won't work. Now, how Israelis are going to be convinced of this, how American politicians are going to be convinced of this, is another issue. But what I argue in the book is that you have to have a solution, whether it's a one-state solution, a two-state solution, a cantonal solution, a binational solution, whatever, regional federation. It has to be based on absolute equality of all kinds of rights. There are now two national entities there. There's an Israeli national entity. It's been created. People say, well, if you say it's a settler colonial project, how can you? The United States is a settler colonial project, which has created a national entity. The difference is that the Palestinians inside Palestine are as numerous, probably a little more numerous, than the Jewish population of Israel. So the population under Israel's control is majority Arab. And then you have another several million, 5 or 6 million Palestinians living forced out of Palestine and living in Jordan and in other countries. Any solution has to accept that both of these groups, national groups, have to have equal rights. How you do that is, to my way of thinking, at least secondary. Confederation, cantonal, one state, two states, three states, whatever, federation, doesn't matter. But there has to be absolute equality of property rights, of civil rights, of religious rights. You can't say this belonged to us 2,000 years ago, therefore we take it over and our worship takes precedence over your worship. You can't have that. You can't say, if you left your property in 1948, it now belongs to us. The kinds of things that nobody would accept for Europe after World War II are not acceptable in Palestine after 1948, whether in terms of population, whether in terms of property, whether in terms of rights, individual or collective. Now, how you get there, I don't know. You know, I'm a historian. The job description of a historian does not include predicting the future.
Part-time diplomat and a very effective one at both of those, Rashid. Let me close by thanking you for a remarkable book, remarkable history, for sharing your family's intertwined fate with Palestine, and for your call for justice. I like to remind everybody that in 2023 will be the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which calls for exactly what Rashid is just saying, which is dignity for all and human rights for all. And I think we should use the occasion coming up of the Universal Declaration, which is signed by every country in the world, including the United States, including China, including all the rest of the world, to take up the cause of universal justice, because it is not only the right thing to do, but it's the only way we're going to survive and keep peace. Thank you, Rashid, for a fantastic book, 100 Years War on Palestine. Thank you for the wonderful discussion today. Let me thank all of the participants of the book club. To remind you that on April 8th, we're going to have a fantastic discussion with you, the book club members, and myself. I'll be taking questions and hopefully offering some useful answers at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on April 8th. And then our next conversation is on April 26th at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time with the wonderful economist Mariana Mazzucato and her new book, Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, another quest for a fairer and more sustainable world. So please join me on April 8th and on April 26th. Rashid, I know I speak for everybody listening today to thank you so much for your great work and for the wonderful conversation. Thanks
so much for having me. I hope people are inspired to go out and buy the book.
I hope so, and I expect they will be. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Thanks.